So, tēnā koutou katoa and welcome. I'm Jane Bryson. I'm the Dean of the Wellington School of Business and Government at Victoria University of Wellington, Te Herenga Waka. And I just want to give a warm welcome to you all our students and our teachers. And I know we've got a handful of Econ 130 students here this morning too, so thank you for coming along. And I would like to thank our hosts, the Rt Hon Chris Hipkins, the Leader of the Opposition and MP for Rimutaka, and the Honourable Barbara Edmonds, MP for Mana, and also spokesperson on finance, economic development, savings and investment. And also our guest economists, Mark Cox from Business New Zealand and Craig Renney from the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions. So they will be speaking shortly. And to start, just a few words from me about the Wellington School of Business and Government and the university. Quite obviously, we are a capital city business school, and we are embedded in the heart of the city. And we draw on the expertise of businesses, government, and the organisations around us to inform our teaching and research. That allows us to have some pretty exciting real-world projects in our courses, internships and engagement with experts from across Wellington. If the curtains weren't pulled, you could probably see out the window across to the Wellington School of Business and Government on one side of Bunny Street and the law faculty on the other side of Bunny Street. So we're right in the heart of things. And that's what makes us a wee bit different as a business school. If you want to get a head start in your studies, I know some of you are year 13, but some of you are year 12. So the year 12 students next year, when you're in year 13, if you're wanting to get a head start on uni, you could look at doing a university course while you're still at high school. And I've just mentioned a few here, but there are others. So if that's of interest, speak to your careers advisor at your school. The ones we've got mentioned here are the Digital Systems and Information in Business and Society, Accounting for Accountability and Decision Making, and from one of our other faculties, Introduction to Computer Program Design. And of course, we would welcome you all at our open day for the university, which is on the 22nd of August. It will be fun and informative. So if you're thinking about university, please come along. All the different degree programs will be represented there. You can ask lots of questions, find out what you want to know, and you just need to register for that. And we have information, I think, over on the side tables, but on our website as well, and I'm sure your school has information. And lastly, to mention, money's important. When you're thinking about going to university, we do have scholarships available. So those of you that are in year 13 and thinking about university next year, we have scholarships available. You need to apply for them by the 1st of September. So there's quite a range, as you can see there. I won't go through the list, you can see it yourself. Have a look on our website, or again, speak to your careers advisors in your schools. Or if all else fails, email me at the Wellington School of Business and Government, jane.bryson at vuw.ac.nz. So first of all, we'll move to the Honourable Barbara Edmonds and then the Right Honourable Chris Hipkins.
Ena mana ina reo e raurangatahi mā tēnā koutou katoa. Te whaata alofa atu ma le wha alo mā lo le soifua maua ma le langi e mā. Thank you so much, Professor Jane Bryson and the team at the Wellington School of Business and Government for organising this event. For those that don't know, I am a mother of 8 children. My youngest is 12, my eldest is 21. You can do the math. Currently, 3 of my children go to Victoria University or Te Herenga and Waka. They are currently doing, 2 are doing a BCom, 1 is majoring in accounting, the other one in data science, and the third one is doing a Bachelor of Science, majoring in data science. Next year will be a pivotal point for my large family. We will have 4 at university and 4 at college, so we're almost on the home straight. I'm really happy to be here today to greet you all, to welcome you to your place, to Parliament. I just want to acknowledge our two economists who are here. They're the brains of this event today. You can question them really tough. So to Craig Renney and to Mark Cox from Business New Zealand. I'm also proud to co-host today's event with my boss and my good friend, the Right Honourable Chris Hipkins. And it's really great to see so many engaged students from across our schools here in the Wellington region. Your presence today really speaks volumes about your curiosity and your commitment to understanding New Zealand and the world around you. Today you're going to hear about the budget, and budget decisions shape lives. Shape your parents' lives, your aunties, your uncles, your life, and everybody within your community. Budgets aren't just about numbers on a page. They are a reflection of the values and the choices by the governing parties. Whether it's supporting families, building homes, creating jobs, or funding hospitals, the budget impacts the opportunities available to you and your whānau. That's why conversations like today are so important. Not just for economists and for politicians, but for everyone, especially future leaders like yourselves. Understanding how public policy works doesn't necessarily just have to happen or start at university. It can start when you're in secondary school, or for a lot of kids even when they're younger. Asking tough questions is key to a strong democracy, hence why Chris has to leave at 12:30 for question time prep. Today is about lifting the curtain on the parliamentary process and showing you a little bit about how real-world economic decisions are made and are debated. Chris and I are both here today because we believe your voices matter. Thank you for being a part of this important kōrero, and I look forward to today's discussion. Again, send the hard questions to those two guys. Thank you very much, and Chris, over to you.
Te whare e tū nei, te papa e tā koutou nei, tātou katoa te hunga ora, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everybody to Parliament. First things first, I saw you all pull out your cell phones before, so I'm going to tell the Prime Minister that you're all at a school event and you've all had your cell phones, and he'll come down and he'll sort that out for you all. But welcome to Parliament. You are very warmly welcomed here, and I hope you find today's seminar a really, really useful experience. Let me confess right up front, I'm not an economist. So I'm going to share some observations about the government's budget process that you won't hear from an economist. And it might contradict some of the things that you've been learning about in school as well. So the first things first, I remember studying economics in school, and I remember the first thing we learned was all about rational choice and how about economic theories all about humans maximising their utility from the decisions they make. They're wrong. Human beings are anything but rational. And so when you think about the debate around the economy and you think about the debate around the government's budget, one of the first things you have to remember is that people matter, relationships matter, and fundamentally human beings are social beings. How we interact with one another matters, and we don't always make choices that are in our own personal best interests. And governments need to remember that when we're making decisions about the budget and about things that affect the whole population. We're not always completely rational in the decisions that we make. The second thing that I want you to remember about the government budget is that the government budget is not an economic strategy. Governments managing their budget is only one of the things that governments do that affect the broader economy. So when it comes to things like how much it costs for you to live, where you live, how much it costs to buy a house, whether you can access the things that you need to be able to access to live good lives, the government's budget is only one part of all of that, and decisions that government takes in other areas affect all of those things as well. And too often, when we're talking about the economy, we're talking about the government's budget. The government's budget is only one part of the debate around the economy, and yet in this building, if you listen to the debate around the government's budget, you'd think that that's all there is around the debate around the economy, and that's simply not true. But the third thing that I want you to remember about the government budget, and this is the most important, generally speaking, if you say three things in a speech, people will only remember one thing. So remember this one thing. The government's budget measures the cost of government action it does not measure the cost of government inaction. And it is possibly the most fundamental thing to understand about the government budget and about political debate in New Zealand. Because so much of the debate we have in New Zealand isn't about the cost of action, but the cost of inaction or the consequences of inaction. So let me give you a very practical example. I was Minister of Education for 5 years, and I found that we had a whole lot of schools across the country that had really badly run down school buildings. Some of them are reflected here today, are recognised by the uniforms that you have. As Minister of Education, if I chose not to put a new roof on a school that had a leaky roof, I saved the government's money. The government's budget looked better because the government budget would record the cost of me putting a new roof onto the school. On the other hand, the cost of a new roof was a lot cheaper than letting the building rot and finding 10 years down the track we couldn't just re-roof the school, we had to completely replace it. And yet the government's budget won't reflect that. It will incentivise us not putting a new roof on the school because that saves money, even though 10 years down the track it's going to cost us more money to replace the building than it would have cost to put a new roof on. And when you think about the debate around government budgets in New Zealand and why things aren't the way we would like them to be, that is the most important thing to understand. Governments can balance their budgets by pushing costs further and further into the future. But eventually, someone, all of you, have to pay for the consequences of those decisions. So as the next generation of New Zealand workers, just remember that the decisions that we avoid taking today are ultimately going to cost all of you more in the future. So if we don't re-roof the school, if we don't protect the environment, the cost of environmental protection in the short term is more often than not cheaper than the costs of not protecting it in the long term. But governments make those decisions on a daily basis. And in doing so, what they're actually doing is transferring costs onto all of you, the next generation of New Zealanders. So, I told you I wanted you to remember one thing, and it's really simple. Government budgets measure the cost of action. They do not measure the true cost of inaction. And actually, that's what all of political debate boils down to, whether we should or shouldn't do things and how much they're going to cost. But always remember that that debate's always very one-sided because it only measures the immediate cost of action, not the long-term cost of inaction. So I hope you find today's presentations from economists who actually know what they're talking about to be useful to you. I hope you enjoy your visits here at Parliament. So, nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
So hello everyone, it's great to be here. I'm not actually going to say much about the details of the budget. What I want to do instead is to focus on some of the shorter and longer term issues that constrain the choices that the government now and any future government will be able to make. And what I'll do at the end of my little talk is to echo some of the things that Chris Hipkins was just talking about, the place of the budget in the wider scheme of things. But a bit about myself. I work for Business New Zealand. I don't know if you'd heard of us, but we are a membership organisation. We represent in total about 76,000 businesses in New Zealand, from the very large ones to the very small ones. And we do advocacy work trying to persuade the government of the policies that we think they should set in place to grow prosperity and grow the budget, grow the economy and make things better for everyone. We also do networking activities so businesses can get together and spark off one another. And we provide various kinds of business support. A bit about me. I've been an economist for 47 years in one capacity or other, and I've worked both in the UK and in New Zealand. I don't actually belong to any political party, but I find politics is really fascinating. It's a bit like watching a blood sport at times. When I tell people that I'm an economist, they tend to react by saying, well, either they sort of, their eyes glaze over completely and they make an excuse and go off and talk to someone else, or they say, I really don't understand what economics is about. So what I like to do when I'm talking to people trying to explain what economics is to quote for them the very first thing that appeared in my first year university text on economics. And it started, the very first page of the text said that economics is about the allocation of scarce resources between competing demands. That textbook was written about 60 years ago by an eminent economist from Canada. His name was Richard Lipsey, and he's still going strong at the age of 96. But what this definition implies is that virtually everyone, including everyone here, is an economist, even though not many people make a living at it. And I say virtually everyone is an economist because we all make choices about how we devote our resources, whether it be time, energy, skills, money if you have any, to the various different competing activities we want to participate in. And I say this because the budget, in my mind, is quintessentially an exercise in allocating scarce resources between competing demands, different needs or demands. So, looking at the big picture of economics in the budget, we have scarce resources, which are taxes, other receipts, which might be, for example, from asset sales, and the other main category is borrowing. But on the other hand, there's a whole heap of competing demands which are demanding money to enable them to take place. So we have education, health, superannuation, job seeker benefits, and so on. And the big point is that there are limitations on what the government can do to increase the resources, and there's so many different competing demands on those resources. And the thing about the demands is they're insatiable, and I'll come back to that point shortly. And because demands are insatiable, it's easy for government spending to be greater than its revenues, and that's what leads to budget deficits. Now, you may have heard of the term structural deficit, and this is when budget deficits happen even when the economy is buoyant and there's a good inflow of tax receipts. New Zealand has a structural deficit now, but because budget deficits have become persistent, and they look like remaining persistent in the future for some time to come. So the first thing that you have to think about when you're talking about budgets is that the structural deficit is a huge challenge. And if you look at that, that graph up there, I don't know if you can all see that well, but during the past 20 years, there have been times when government revenues have been greater than expenses and times when the opposite has been the case. But over that 20-year period, there have been 12 years in which there have been budget deficits and 7 years where there have been surpluses, or 1 year when the budget more or less balanced completely. But the worrying thing is that there's been a budget deficit every year since 2020. And what we heard from what we heard about in the last budget back in May was that there's expected to be a budget deficit all the way through to at least 2029. And this matters because in simple terms, it means that the government will accumulate larger and larger debt, and the result that will be that paying back that debt will cost more and more each year. And there's also risk that if the debt grows larger and larger and larger, the rate of interest that the government has to pay on that debt will increase. So to get rid of the structural deficit and an ever-increasing debt, the government needs to do one of three things. It needs to increase the revenues, it needs to reduce spending, or some combination of the two. So the next slides will look at the spending and revenue challenges. So the numbers I'm going to quote here are sort of pretty rough numbers, but in broad terms, the budget we just had back in May announced government spending of about 150 billion. The main areas of spending, if you can see that, are health, which accounts for 22% of the total. And this is one of these insatiable demands because partly because the population is growing, but partly because medical science is improving, so that there are now diseases and conditions that can be treated successfully, which couldn't be treated before, but these novel treatments cost huge amounts of money. The second largest is social security and welfare, and that accounts for 17% of the total. And this covers things like job seeker spending, job seeker support for people who are unemployed, supported living payments for people who can't work for various reasons, and the accommodation supplement for people whose incomes are so low that they can't afford a rent. Also, that covers some people who have a mortgage. The third largest area is superannuation, pensions for old people aged 65 plus. That's 16%, but it's only the third largest for the time being. One area you might be interested in now is the proportion of the budget that's spent on education. That's the fifth ranked area at 14%. You notice in the graph there there's a segment of the pie for finance, which is debt repayment essentially. And that's going to grow because, I said, we're going to accumulate ongoing deficits. In my mind, the biggest challenge by far when it comes to government spending is how to afford health and superannuation. And these areas are going to grow and grow and grow because of the ageing population. And there's virtually nothing the government can do to stop that expenditure growing. And this is because we now have about 850,000 people in our population who are aged 65 plus, who both during superannuation and whose health needs are growing and growing and growing as they get older. And that 850,000 is going to grow to about 1.5 million by 2050. And there are other areas of spending which are politically difficult for the government to try and reduce or contain if it wanted to. Things like social security and welfare, education spending. In other words, there's very little room for manoeuvre for the government when it comes to trying to manage spending. Moving on to the revenue side, that's equally challenging because in rough terms, the revenues were in the last budget announced about 140 billion, so that implies a budget deficit of approximately 10 billion. The thing about New Zealand is that we have a very, very simple tax structure compared to most other countries. We have four types: individual income tax, companies tax on their profits, GST, and others, which is mainly excise duties on things like tobacco, alcohol, and petrol. Other countries, for example, have things like capital gains tax, wealth tax, and inheritance tax. But it's actually very difficult politically, politically difficult to raise more money from existing taxes or to introduce new types of taxes. So the way I see it is it's very difficult, it's going to remain very difficult for the government to get rid of the structural deficit, especially when you consider the makeup of the government and the likely makeup of future governments we're going to have. At the moment, there's a good chance, the way I see it, that whatever main party is going to get the largest share of the vote in the next election is likely to have two coalition partners. And it also looks to me that the role of the minor parties in the coalitions is going to grow over time. So they're going to be able to exert more influence on the lead party, whether it's National or Labour. To conclude, I want to echo something that Chris Hipkins said about the importance or the role of the budget in the overall scheme of things. And I actually agree with him. It's not all that important. Partly because a lot of what's announced in the budget is foreshadowed by announcements beforehand, so it doesn't have the excitement that it used to have. And the other thing is to remember is that the budget only plays a relatively small part in determining how the economy performs. There are other things, policy areas that matter at least as much. So we have things, we had the investment boost in the budget, which makes it easier for businesses to invest. But there's other things outside the budget that need to be legislated for. And I think of things like overseas investment, whether that should be encouraged or discouraged, whether education should be reformed, whether resource management should be reformed, and whether employment law needs to be reformed. So it's a really, really tough problem. So in conclusion, I just want to ask Barbara one question. Barbara, do you really want to be Finance Minister? Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Well, kia ora everyone. My name is Craig Renney. I'm the Economist and Director of Policy at the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions, Te Kawe Kai Mahi. Thank you all very much for being here. The CTU represents around 350,000 workers across Aotearoa in about 35 different trade unions. Can I thank Professor Jane Bryson and the workers at Victoria University, Mark for his presentation just before, the Leader of the Opposition for speaking, and in my opinion, the best speaker on finance in the House, Barbara Edmonds, for her words. Can I ask you a question? What is a budget? Because a budget, you think it's all about money and numbers and pulling together budget documents and doing all that stuff, right? It's not. Budget's about choices. And what you do when you make choices, you show what you think is valuable because you choose to spend money in areas that you think is valuable. So President Biden has this great quote. Don't tell me your values. Show me your budget and I'll tell you your values. And that's really what a budget is all about. I've been really lucky in my career. I've been upstairs in room 7.6 in this building, and I've written 3 budgets for the first Labour government, right? And I can tell you the Treasury forces you to make decisions and choices about absolutely everything in the budget. Nothing in the budget is natural. It's not like coastal erosion that doesn't just happen, right? Everything that's in there is a deliberate decision. So let's have a look at what the choices in this budget say. So the Honourable Nicola Willis, who is at exactly this podium, you can see by the microphone, at the last budget. So what happened there? So we decided to, in your money, these decisions were made for you, we decided to spend $6.7 billion on a new tax cut for companies to invest. Great. That might mean we get some more business, might mean we get some more economic activity, some more jobs, but we're giving money to companies to buy things like oil rigs, double cab utes, IT equipment. We have no idea what they're going to buy, and it actually has no limit. And that's all money that you could be spending on something else. That's a choice. Well, what about $500 million in tax that companies like Google or Meta or Facebook or anybody else or Uber were going to pay as digital services taxes? Well, we decided not to do that. So they're not going to have to pay that tax. So somebody else is going to have to pay it. Well, what about the $200 million that we decided to spend on oil and gas exploration? We've tried for 10 years to find any new gas in New Zealand, and we haven't found any. So what about tuition fees? Well, the government decided to put up tuition fees this year by 6%, on top of the 6% that they put them up last year. And they also decided to increase your student loan repayments by fixing the repayment level, in the words of the Treasury budget document, indefinitely, which clips the government an extra $65 million over the next 4 years from all of your student loan repayments. Congratulations. So what isn't there? There's no money for climate change in the budget. That's a choice. There's no money for climate change. There's no money for the environment. There are actually cuts to the money that's available for conservation. Budgets are about choices. Choices tell you about values. What are the values that this budget is telling you? Well, let's have a look at the values in welfare. So this is the Honourable Louise Upston, who's the Minister for Social Development and Child Poverty Reduction. We decided to end job seeker support for 18 and 19-year-olds who will now be required to be looked after by their parents. We decided to means test Best Start. Best Start's a payment to parents when they have a child. Everyone gets it for the first year, and then some parents get it in the second and the third years. If you have two parents who now are both on the minimum wage, none of them will get Best Start. That takes $72 a week out of their pockets when they first have a child. That's a choice. We decided to basically take $43 a week out of 61,000 families at this budget to help pay for that tax cut. And we decided to miss all of our child poverty targets. We have 3 legally binding child poverty targets under the Child Poverty Reduction Act 2018. Right now in New Zealand, in the last measure, there are 156,900 children in this country who live in material poverty. That means they don't have 2 pairs of shoes. They don't have a winter coat. They regularly go without 2 meals with protein a day. But we're choosing to do nothing about it at this budget. What does that tell you about the values of this budget? And so, what about health and education funding, the things that people find particularly important? The things that Mark said, where there's, not unreasonably, there's huge demand. Well, health needed $2 billion just to stand still, just to pay to keep the lights on. That's just the cost of inflation for the health system. But it got $1.37 billion, and $1.7 billion in total, including all the new funding that was made available to it for new programs. So what that means is, at best, it's $300 million, or due to the magic of the Public Finance Act, because we multiply things by 4, $1.2 billion short. New programs were announced, but we didn't get any cash. That's a choice. And then in education received a 1.5% increase in the school's operation grant. Great, more money for schools. Only inflation's 2.6%. For the econ students over there, that means that's a 1% real terms cut in all of the funding that's being made available to your schools. And learning support received $395 million. Great. That's some of the most valuable spending we can do inside education. But we paid for it by cutting Kahuako, Māori and Pacifica education programs, which collectively lost $454 million. We made a choice that one was more important than the other. We made that choice in your name. So, what about government investment? Because everything I've talked about today is just day-to-day spending, right? This is just, stuff where you consume stuff. Government investment is where you build new things. The roof that the Leader of the Opposition talked about. So, the Prime Minister said, our relentless focus on growth is why you won't see any irresponsible spending spree in the budget. New Zealand cannot simply afford it or put it at risk. And then he went on to say, New Zealand's finances are under control and we're on track to reach surplus in 2029. We've put a lid on government debt. That's very important, some strong words there, right? When someone tells you it's raining, right, do you accept them or do you look out of the window? Because this is net debt on the IMF measure when we compare countries. Yeah? Remember, we've put a lid on government debt. This is New Zealand's debt. 24% GDP. This is Australia's, the UK's, 92%, the US, 95%, and this is Japan, 130%. But apparently New Zealand has a debt problem, and we need to put a lid on debt, because that's why you can't afford the $2 billion school rebuild program, which was supposed to happen and didn't. Why we didn't invest in hospitals around the country, why Dunedin Hospital has been downgraded. Because we need to make sure our debt doesn't get out of control. Is Japan's debt out of control? Is Japan a basket case? Is the US actually, don't answer the question of whether or not the US is a basket case. But how many people are thinking about leaving here when they graduate or go somewhere else and go to Australia? Because the jobs are better, sunshine's better, yeah? We lose a New Zealander every 7 minutes and 30 seconds overseas right now. And why do we do that? Because we don't invest in the stuff in this country. It's a choice. We make that choice, and you can see that choice in our investment decisions. So that capital investment, the stuff that's keeping the debt low, well, this is budget 23, so the last budget of the last government. Then the first budget of the new government, and then this budget. We're spending less every year on new stuff. Why is that important? Because right now in New Zealand, we have a $104 billion infrastructure gap. Those are schools, hospitals, roads, things that should exist and don't, because we haven't paid for them. Yeah? That's a choice. And what we're really saying when we make that choice is, guess what? You're going to have to pay for it, because we're not prepared to, because we want to keep that debt figure low. So we're prepared for you to make that difficult decision, because we're not prepared to make that difficult decision. So congratulations, you get to carry that debt because we won't. That's a choice. And when we look at the consequence of those choices, who here would ever like to own their own home? Great. Best investment you can ever do in New Zealand, right? You can take somebody else's money from the bank, you can pay it off, and at the end you get all the proceeds tax-free. Congratulations. Yeah? But this is house prices over the forecast period. House prices are going to grow by 30%. Why do they grow by 30%? Because we're not building enough houses. Why we're not building enough houses? Because we've got 15,000 fewer people working in construction in New Zealand, because they've all left to go to Australia. And this is wages. Over the same forecast period, wages are growing at half the rate of house prices. We're going back to an economy where the fastest way to become wealthy is to own somebody else's home. Probably yours. So we're making a choice. We're making a choice not to tackle that in exactly the same ways we're making a choice not to tackle child poverty. So when someone tells you that they must do something, that we must keep a lid on debt, that we must, not spend more money on child poverty, that we must, take benefits away from 18, 19-year-olds. When someone tells you they must do something, what they mean is they want to do something. Everything that we do in the budget is a choice. We can choose different outcomes. We can choose different futures. And so I want to leave you with that idea of choice, because it's the most important thing that we do in government, is make choices, make decisions. We have a whole debating chamber across the floor there where we get to debate those choices. It's really important that you get involved in the making of those choices. It's really important that you get involved in talking about those choices. And when those choices get made in your name and you don't like them, campaign like hell to get them changed. Thank you all so much for listening.
When budget decisions are made, is that solely based off of the views of the government, or is there any way that, as the general public, we can get our interests put at the forefront of budget decisions?
Do you want me to answer that? Yeah. So first to Mark's question, I do want to be the Minister of Finance, hence I'm still in this role. So the question is whether the public, if I can summarise it, the public have a chance to have their say as to what's in a government's budget. The government budget is solely made by the government, so actually cabinet ministers, so the Minister of Finance, Prime Minister, and the 19 underneath them. Ultimately, the decision is made by the public at voting time. So if you like what a particular political party has said, well, if you elect me, I will give you a $250 tax cut, which then changed to up to, which then changed to actually we don't know how many families got a $250 tax cut. You make your choice at the election. That is ultimately really the only chance the public get to choose what's in a budget, because you're voting for the manifesto or the policies of a political party. The public can also, though, make their views very clearly known that they don't like the government's choices. So, for example, this budget took away close to $13 billion from pay equity claims. Pay equity claims, I'm not going to go into explaining what that is. They cancelled 33 claims by low-paid workers effectively many of them were women. That ultimately led to some protests, led to a People's Select Committee being formed by ex-female MPs, and also led to a number of people basically writing to the government telling them they hated that choice. So you can still make your voice known, but actually, when it comes to time to vote, that is when you make your voice most clearly known.
Could I just add to that? Yes, the government does make the ultimate choice, but there are a process of lobbying by different organisations in the country. It might be Forest and Bird, for example. Lobbying over a period of time might be years, trying to get the government's attention and saying we need to spend more on this, or might be conversely another organisation saying we spend less on that. So yeah, there's a point in time, the 6 to 9 months before a budget is essentially up to the government, but any time individuals and especially representative organisations can get involved in lobbying.
The only thing I would add to this, having been involved in writing 3 of them, there are a couple of organisations of government that are really important. So the Treasury does all of the economic and fiscal forecasts independently. So it asks the government what it wants to do. It then produced some forecasts on the basis of those decisions. You get to tweak that a couple of times on the way through, but they're all independently produced by the Treasury. You can't influence the Treasury as to what those outcomes are. And the Treasury is very clear to make it clean. If you read the budget documents, there's one budget document called the Budget Economic and Fiscal Update, or the BEFU. That's the Treasury's document. All of the numbers in there belong to the Treasury. Then there's the budget document, which belongs to the government. And all of the numbers and all of the words in there belong to the government. So we have a very clean system in New Zealand for writing budgets, and a very good system for writing budgets in New Zealand. And as a consequence, the Treasury plays an outsized role in New Zealand in comparison to other countries where that wouldn't be the case.
Thanks. Any further questions? One over here. Carl? No, to your, oh, one there, okay.
So in that case, would that mean that under the New Zealand fiscal system, groups such as youth who might be disproportionately affected by the choices made in the budget might be underrepresented in making those choices? Like, for example, I know with KiwiSaver, they cut the payments by half, but framed it as a big boon for youth when they can claim it a year earlier.
So does anybody remember in the 2023 campaign any of the parties who are now in government campaigning on cutting KiwiSaver government contributions or allowing KiwiSaver to be accessed by 16 to 18-year-olds? Can anybody remember that commitment? All came down to a choice. So effectively you can, from your perspective, if it is that you feel like youth are not being heard in this budget, and for example, the example that Craig used around 18 and 19-year-olds, you're now left to your parents to now fund you. The Minister of Finance said when she was standing at that podium on budget day that anecdotally she had been told by parents to help them get their children off the couch. There's a question for the Minister of Finance. Where are the jobs? Because I don't know if any of you have tried to apply for a part-time job or a full-time job. We have 30,000 less jobs now in New Zealand's economy, and we have places which say they have up to 200 or 400 applicants. So I totally accept the perspective for possibly many of you in the room, or maybe not, that this budget has not helped youth. Another very clear example, our calculations of cutting that KiwiSaver government contribution in half. For an 18-year-old, by the time they go to retire, they would have lost $66,000 from the government contribution. Sure, they're going to be lifting up their contribution, however, the government has managed to save a lot of money from that. So again, budgets are about choices. They show the values of the political parties, and clearly I'm a Labour MP. I don't agree with their choices, and I believe that the values they showed in their budget means that they don't actually respect our youth and our rangatahi voice.
I think even if you might be too young to vote, there's no reason why you can't become involved in pressuring governments to change the way things happen. No matter what party you might support, you can belong to the youth wing of that party and help create policy and an impetus for change. And the other thing is, even though you might not be old enough to vote, you could probably still get in touch with your the MP in your electorate, because there used to be a song that I heard a lot in my youth, where there's an American politician being quoted as saying, "I'd like to help you, son, but you're too young to vote." But I'm sure you wouldn't get that sort of response now if you wanted to go and see your electorate MP.
I've got very little about it except for the fact that politicians, and especially ministers, love feedback, right? Because they make decisions, you make policy decisions, and actually you've got little idea as to actually how well it's going to go down. We can test this, we go to focus groups to do other things, but it's only when it lands with the public that actually you get a sense of what's really happening. As a consequence, when you say something, they want to hear. There's not politics is a game of popularity, right? The first thing they teach you in politics is how to count, right? How to make sure you've got enough votes, right? And if you're going to annoy your whole group of people, right, you want to make sure that that's not a group of people who are going to vote you out at the next election, right? So campaign, get out there, make your voice heard, because there's no other way of engaging in the policy process except at the election and by either or standing outside on the forecourt of this building, right, and telling the politicians in here what you really think. Because otherwise, they'll never hear from you.
Thank you. There's a question over there, Carl.
Would not a simple solution to youth needs being overlooked in budgets and in government decisions be to lower the voting age to 16 or lower?
So the question is, wouldn't it be a simple solution is to lower the voting age? Is that correct? So my personal position is I'm okay with lowering the voting age to 16. And the reason why I say that is there is a very big difference between your generation and, say, my generation and maybe the generation before me. And the big change is this. Back in my day, if you wanted information, you had to log on to a computer, or you had what were called encyclopedias in your house, which are basically a set of books. You have the world at your fingertips as rangatahi. We never had the world at our fingertips. So the climate strike, the student climate strike, that was through your organisation as rangatahi to basically tell governments that we don't want our world to burn and we actually want to live in this world for the future, so make better decisions for us. So it is a simple way is to reduce the voting age. My personal view is, again, I'm okay with 16 because I've got children of that age and they are much more highly engaged than I ever was. But when it comes to voting ages, that's a constitutional policy that needs to be made, and it's a decision, including if we extend the government parliamentary term to 4 years or 5 years rather than 3 years. That all needs to be done through a policy that goes through Parliament, a bill that then gets the majority, again, as Craig said, the numbers game, to get it basically passed. So it could be a simple solution, but it still doesn't mean that even if you reduce the voting age to 16 or lower it, still means that people have a choice to vote or not. So it might be that might bring up different impacts as well.
I think there was another, yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
I want to ask about the effectiveness of the $6.7 billion tax write-off of businesses. Is that based off business profits or business revenue? Because I remember reading an article a couple months ago that we were looking at a record number of bankruptcies in New Zealand. So if businesses aren't making any money, then what is the true effectiveness of this tax write-off?
So before I became an MP, I'm a tax lawyer. That's actually my professional career. The gentleman can talk about the actual economic growth figures and what they are over the certain time period that Treasury put in the budget economic fiscal update. But effectively, being able to incentivise businesses to spend more money on capital items like tech, like a ute, like oil rigs, like a building, the tax incentive basically allows them to do so. It is based on basically, it is profit. So you got your profit, and then you got to start doing your deductions. And that's how that credit works. So basically, I made X amount of money, and now I can deduct the up to 20% the first year, the cost of that ute, plus whatever it is, the depreciation over the estimated useful life. See, I'm a tax lawyer, so sorry about that. So ultimately, it's a tax credit or a deduction against ultimately the revenue that business then has to find that basically their taxable earnings that they need to return to the Crown. The growth figures, though, about what the government estimates that to be, I think I'll leave it to these two to talk about.
Yes, growth. The government is in a real funk at the moment because it looked earlier this year as though the economy was really starting to kick in, but it's become evident in the last couple of months recently that this is not going to be the case. So we had economic growth in the first quarter of this year, ended in March. If anything, we're probably going to have a decrease in GDP in the June quarter, and it's now looking as though it's going to be really difficult to build up head of steam in the economy. Two of the things my organisation is responsible for, you might heard about, is the Performance of Services Index and the Performance of Manufacturing Index, and both of those currently in negative territory, indicating that the economy is actually shrinking. Earlier this year, the Performance of Manufacturing Index looked pretty good, and it was growing, and everyone's thinking, oh, come on, we turned a corner here. But now it's looking as though the PMI, the Performance of Manufacturing Index, has now gone into negative territory again. So that's why we're wondering when we're going to really get back to solid and continuing growth.
So to help answer your question, we're going to buy there's the kernel of a good idea here with the investment boost program. The challenge is that it's on everything. Yeah. So you buy an oil rig. An oil rig's about $1 billion. Yeah. So $1 billion, that means you get $200 million back as essentially a tax write-off in the first year. Now, if you're paying $50 million of corporate tax every year, yeah, that means you've got 4 years where you're not going to pay any tax because you've got this loss that you can keep writing off your tax against. And so you get that $200 million essentially for free. Yeah? Now, that's great, but you are probably going to buy the oil rig anyway. So it's just free money. Right? Same with if you buy a new double cab ute, great, yeah? An extra 20% means you just get the Ford Raptor package. You get all the fruit on the car, right? Because the government's paying for it, yeah? That doesn't lead to productive growth. It certainly doesn't lead to sustainable growth. If the program was very targeted at the things that we want to see, advanced manufacturing, IT, skills acquisition, things that leave long-term economic growth benefits, great. The challenge is that we've got $6.7 billion set aside, but we actually don't know how much we're going to spend because the scheme is uncapped, which means we could spend a lot more money than we were anticipating. And overseas jurisdictions have had exactly that experience of the companies coming along and using that uncapped scheme to spend a lot of cash because they can now access it. Now, to Mark's point about the economy declining and heading backwards, that is very true. The challenge is that the GDP figures, the consequence of that investment boost, are tiny, right? In the order of 0.2% or so across for 20 years, right? So it doesn't make a huge amount of difference, right? And the question I've got is a choice. If you had $6.7 billion, could you choose to invest it somewhere else and get a better economic return? And that's the question we should really be asking about the investment boost program, because I put it to you, many of us could spend that money and get more skills, get more apprentices, get more housing, and actually have longer, better-term consequences for New Zealand than someone being able to buy something they were going to buy already.
One more thing. Sorry, I'll add one more thing because you are commerce students as well and probably budding business owners. You can only access that tax incentive if you have the money to spend. So to your point about high company liquidation numbers, it's unlikely that those companies or other companies who don't have the cash flow, they won't be able to access that tax incentive because they might not have the money to spend it on a double cab ute or a new computer or something else. Because generally, when you run a business and you don't know whether you're going to have enough customers because the rest of the economy is really stagnant, then actually you try and not spend the money. The government is trying to use the tax incentive to try and get people to spend the money, but actually some people just don't have the cash flow in order to spend it in the first place.
We've probably got time for one more question. What about over here? Oh, and we might come to that one too, ultimately. No?
So this is a question more specifically for Craig and what he was talking about, but when you showed that graph about the different debts of countries, do you think that, like through showing that, what you're trying to say is that we actually could have more debt? Or I guess what was the point of you showing that? And also do you think that if we had more debt possibly now, as Chris Hipkins was talking about, in the future that could actually decrease our debt because it would have more positive long-term impacts if we spend more now in preventative measures, I guess?
It's a great question. Thank you for it. We act permanently in New Zealand as if we have a debt crisis, as if we can't spend any more money, right? As if we can't borrow, right? As the Leader of the Opposition said in the room, we know the cost of everything but the value of nothing, right? So I can tell you pretty much every day what it's going to cost to build Dunedin Hospital, yeah? What I can't tell you is what not building Dunedin Hospital for 20 years has cost in lives lost, productivity lost, lost wages. Dunedin Hospital is a training hospital, right? So we're training our next generation of nurses and doctors in a poor facility. If we're training them in a modern facility, they'd be better doctors and nurses, right? So we don't measure any of those benefits, but we do measure the cost. And because we treat debt as an emergency all the time, we limit our debt position. We do that for a perfectly good reason, which is we have earthquakes, we have natural disasters, and we don't want our debt to be like somewhere else because we have to keep a little bit of a buffer. But that little bit of a buffer isn't where that number is. And those countries there, Japan certainly has earthquakes. Yeah? The US has natural disasters. Australia has wildfires and has natural disasters, right? But because we keep our debt levels so low, we don't invest in the buildings, the plant, the other things that would actually deliver long-term sustainable economic growth in this country, right? We're a country of two islands, yeah? But we're about to take away, potentially, the rail ferry between those two islands. Will that make us more or less productive? Will that put more cars on the road or will it put less cars on the road, right? Because we don't invest, we don't then get the benefits of investing, our economy doesn't grow, and our chronic productivity problem gets worse. So when you say, could we invest more? We absolutely could. The last time we put borrowing into the markets, so about every 6 weeks we get through the debt management office and the Treasury building over there, the debt management office put about $100 million of government debt into the markets, right? There was $550 million of bids for that $100 million of debt. So there's plenty of demand for New Zealand's debt. Our credit rating went up during COVID rather than down, right? We can do more, we should do more, because if we don't, we're going to lock in that lack of productivity because we don't have the assets that we should have paid for. And importantly, we're going to hope that you pay for it rather than we do.
I think it's also important to note that it actually matters what you're accumulating debt for. Sort of things Craig was mentioning were things that help the productive capacity of the economy, which is great as far as I'm concerned. If you're just splurging on... If you're splurging on current expenditure, giving freebies to everyone, that's a different picture. But I'd also caution that, we might look to have very low debt levels compared to, say, Japan, but if we suddenly decided we're going to go from debt being 20% of GDP up to 60%, that starts to make lenders nervous. because they're going to require a higher rate of interest, and they might start to view New Zealand differently. So if we are to grow the debt, it can't leap in great bounds from 20 to 30 to 40 over time. Yeah.
And I would just add, to support the comments made by our economists, is that spending debt for capital items, so again for the productive part of the economy, to build bridges on a ferry, on schools and hospital builds, really good areas to be able to use debt to fund. What's not good is to use debt to fund everyday operational costs like tax cuts. So tax cuts, for example, that tax package for the Minister of Finance, it was $10 billion for the income tax cut portion of that $250 apparently that most people were going to get. However, in that budget, the government had to borrow $12 billion that year. So there's the numbers there. Borrowing for tax cuts, which is an everyday expense, as opposed to schools, hospitals, other construction area, infrastructure areas, is really concerning. And the big concern for me as a Labour Party member is if you look through when you don't and you pull back government investment in infrastructure, we lose workers. We have lost 17,000 construction sector jobs. How much more money would those 17,000 construction sector workers, if they had jobs to go to, how much money would that put back into our economy? How many jobs does that save? So debt is good for capital items, not so good for everyday expenditure.
I just want to say a very big thank you to all of you for coming along today and for asking great questions, and I hope you found it informative and are mildly energised and politicised. And I would like to say a very big thank you to the Honourable Barbara Edmonds, not only for hosting us but also for speaking on the panel, and to Craig Renney and Mark Cox from the CTU and Business New Zealand for their expert presentations. So thank you very much.